Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. It's particularly difficult on a Monday night to come out and pay any attention to politics whatsoever. It's particularly difficult this far out from a primary election to find interest in politics at all, especially in North Carolina. In this state, we have such a late primary that the presidential campaigns never really pay attention to us. So the people of North Carolina are not accustomed to paying that much attention to politics. So to get people at all to show up this far out is a pretty big deal, and I really want to thank you guys for coming out today. My name is Glen Bradley. In 2010, I ran for the North Carolina State House of Representatives. We ran in what was considered an absolutely impossible district. House District 49 was all of Franklin County, a little piece of Nash, and then a big gerrymander up into Halifax County. This was, when we started running, it was a D+8 district. By the time of the election, it was only considered D+3. It had moved that much, and of course, it was a strong Republican year, but we won a district that was universally considered absolutely impossible. Towards the very end of that campaign, the Republican Party of North Carolina ended up starting to help out and contribute with mail-outs, with money, because most of what they were trying to do, they were trying to take resources from other campaigns where Democrats were running against Republicans, and if they put resources into my campaign, even though they didn't think I would win, it would cause the Democrats to put more resources into this one and make it more likely that their guys would win. Well, what ended up happening is we were outspent 7-1. We spent a grand total of about $26,000, and our opponents spent $138,000. As a matter of fact, you probably saw television ads against me in the Wake County area, where my opponent basically came out and said that little old me all by myself was going to repeal the 17th Amendment and take away your right to vote for senator. Well, that had come from a discussion that I had had talking to people about the checks and balances on government power as to how the founders created the vision for the United States of America. We're all familiar with the checks and balances between Congress, the judiciary, and the executive branch, but what we're not taught in school anymore is originally there were checks and balances between the federal government and the state government. One of the biggest checks and balances between federal and state government was the idea that the state legislatures, the general assemblies, had the power to elect the U.S. senators. Now, what that meant was that the U.S. senator was beholden to the state legislature in all 50 states. And because of that, you also had the senator have responsibility for approving foreign treaties. The Senate has a responsibility for approving the president's cabinet. The Senate has all this extra power over and above the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives in Congress holds the purse strings. All spending bills come from them. But the Senate had all these other powers because they were answerable to the state assemblies, which the representatives were not. Well, there was a big corruption case out of Montana. A gentleman had actually spent some $10,000 apiece to buy everyone's votes, and rather than addressing that corruption and repairing it, they passed the 17th Amendment and did away with General Assembly selecting senators altogether. The problem is this got rid of a huge check and balance on federal power, and we see the effects of that today. Back in 1925, the entire volume of U.S. code, that's every federal law that is on the books, the entire volume of U.S. code in 1925 fit into a single book, this thick. That was it in 1925. Today, we take up 10 gigantic multi-level bookshelves. There are literally 5.8 million either lines or words of U.S. code, and no one person can possibly read all of that in a lifetime and hold an in-depth understanding of it. If we as people can't even read all of federal law to understand it, how are we supposed to obey it? It's gotten way out of control. The federal laws have gotten way out of control, and it's time to restore the constitutional order. This is exactly what we need to do. One of the things that we have to remember as American citizens is the way the founders and the framers designed this nation. You don't restore the constitutional order from Congress. Congress is not going to call the Constitution on themselves. You restore the constitutional order from the ground up. It has to come from the states, which is why the 10th Amendment is becoming such a big deal throughout the nation today. Montana was one of the first with the Montana Firearms Freedom Act. The Tennessee came back later and passed the Tennessee Firearms Freedom Act. And this is one of the reasons that I got so deeply involved, was that I'm a strict constitutionalist. And I saw that the government was doing all of these things that were so far and removed from the Constitution that we were heading over a cliff. We were in a real emergency. Today, I am firmly convinced that we, as a country, are facing an existential crisis. That is a crisis for the very survival of the United States. And by extension, this affects North Carolina because we're part of the United States. You know, unless we take measures now, if the United States gets in trouble and ends up collapsing, they're going to take us with it. So I ran in 2010 to work on restoring the constitutional order. I made two promises. In 2010. First of all, that I would stand up for the Constitution no matter what, even when it hurts. In other words, when a Democratic bill comes up that violates the Constitution, I'll stand against it. And when a Republican bill comes up that violates the Constitution, I would stand against it. And I did that. And the other promise I made was the number one issue that the people who elected me in 2010 had was job growth. So those are the two things I did. I stood up for the Constitution. I introduced bills in order to restore the constitutional order. And I also introduced House Bill 587, North Carolina Job Growth through Regulatory Reform, which changed the way regulations are written and kept. You know, if we thought that the U.S. Code is out of control, you ought to look at the North Carolina State Register. It is twice as big as U.S. Code. There's no way any one person can understand it. They change it on a daily, almost hourly basis, and it is absolutely out of control. So we have to change the way we do regulations, because these are laws that don't even go through Congress. They go through some bureaucrat in a dark hallway somewhere that we don't even see and we can't even talk to. So we have to change the way regulations are done. That's, believe it or not, that's what we see the most of. We can't even read all of the federal law, and the regulatory burden is 10 times the size of that. So what I did in House Bill 587 was we put together a revolution on how regulations are enacted and how they're passed. We made rules that said that every single regulation in the state of North Carolina has to go through periodic review every year. Someone has to look at them and decide whether we're going to keep them or not. And they had certain criteria that they had to be met. They had to be easily understood by any average person. They had to make sense. They had to be more effective than they cost. In other words, if it cost a ridiculous amount of money and only had a small effect, it couldn't be a regulation. And in addition to those, we also in the bill, we created a commission that would examine the regulatory burden, examine the legislative environment from the perspective of middle and lower income people who wanted to be self-employed, who wanted to earn their own money, and to find out what the roadblocks were, to find out what the barriers to market entry were, and recommend to the legislature law changes that would remove those barriers to entry and allow Americans to be free with their own incomes again. And because of the fact that I promised my district, House District 49, that would be my primary priority, that's what I spent about 90% of my time doing. And what ended up happening was we got thousands and thousands of people that contacted their legislatures, who contacted the Speaker, Tom Tillis, who contacted the Majority Leader, Skip Stam, and through the Campaign for Liberty, who was extraordinarily helpful on this, we put enough pressure that they ended up putting 90% of House Bill 587 into the Senate Joint Committee Bill 781 and passing into law. Now, there's some very critical aspects of that didn't end up in the Senate bill, which is one of the reasons I'm running for Senate today, in order to go fix the damage that they did to the jobs bill when they imported it into Senate Bill 781. And that's absolutely critical. Of course, the other thing that I spend a lot of attention on had to do with restoring the constitutional order. The 10th Amendment Center, which is a nationwide organization that puts together model legislation for the 10th Amendment, such as the Firearms Freedom Act, etc., has recognized me as the #1 premier state legislator in the nation with regards to 10th Amendment legislation. because of my primary focus being to restore the constitutional order, and that's the only tool we have left at the state level now to restore the Constitution. And I know that we don't have 30 and 40 years to do this. We have to do this now. And this is the complaint that a lot of people bring up when I'm talking to them, and they say, "How? Well, you're trying too fast. You're trying to move too quickly." Well, we don't have 30 years to go incrementally. If we don't restore the Constitution now, we're headed down a long, dark hallway from which there's no return. And this is a serious concern of mine. Now, what a lot of people are going to tell you when you go out and you talk to other candidates is that I'm so radical that I didn't get a whole lot done. Well, that's absolutely not true. First of all, most freshmen don't get much done anyway, because the leadership puts the freshmen in a little box and they don't let them out of that box. But the freshmen that were allowed to pass bills were allowed to pass things like making NASCAR the official state sport. You know, there was some city had an oyster festival that was the official oyster festival of North Carolina. As long as the bills don't have a great deal of impact, the freshmen were allowed to bring it to the floor, to bring it to a vote, and have it passed. Well, the bills that I put together had an enormous impact. First of all, the jobs bill changes the way that regulations are done in the state of North Carolina. This is a dramatic and profound impact on the way North Carolina does business. And we got that text passed into law. No other freshman had text nearly as profound passed into law. House Bill 32, the North Carolina Electoral Freedom Act, which is ballot access reform. Another landmark bill. It completely changes the way ballots are accessed in the state of North Carolina. As it stands today, North Carolina has the toughest ballot access laws in the United States. Period. You go to most states and you'll have a Green Party, a Libertarian Party, a Constitution Party. You don't have that in North Carolina because we don't allow it. The North Carolina State Constitution talks about how elections have to be frequent and free. Well, if we don't let people on the ballot, how is that a free election? It's not. So in order to obey the state constitution, we have to have ballot access reform. Right now, it's harder to get on the North Carolina ballot in terms of the number of signatures than it is in California. And look at the difference in population between North Carolina and California. It's not even a contest. So to have our ballot access requirements similar to California in hard numbers, it's mind-boggling. It's ridiculous. So House Bill 32, which is the Electoral Reform Act, would actually bring that back significantly to be more in line with the other states that are around us, like Virginia, South Carolina, and we would have the ability to vote for a Constitution Party, which I think is absolutely critical. If we don't have the ability for principled dissent, then we don't have a free election. And that's critically important. So that's the other thing that we passed out of the House. House Bill 32 was passed out of the House. I'm a primary co-sponsor. The person who is the number one sponsor on electoral freedom is Stephen LaRoque. And Stephen LaRoque is in a whole lot of hot water. He dropped it like a hot potato. So every bit of movement on House Bill 32 has come from me. So that's the other thing that I did. House Bill 32, the Electoral Freedom Act, is another significant and profound piece of legislation we passed out of the House. And no other freshman has passed legislation that profound. Now, beyond that, we have a series of legislation which, if you have a copy of my legislative accomplishments, you'll see that there's a lot of bills that I ended up co-sponsoring in terms of primary co-sponsor and secondary co-sponsor that I fought for. House Bill 650 is huge. We finally brought real castle doctrine to the state of North Carolina. This is something that has been missing in the state of North Carolina for decades and decades, and we finally have castle doctrine. We don't have to worry. If there's an intruder breaking into our house, we don't have to worry about, oh, is he armed, is he not armed, is he going to hurt me, is he not going to hurt me, because if I defend myself, am I going to go to prison? That question's gone. If they're in your house, you can terminate